Hello, everyone. I'm Anil Bansal from Indo-American Arts Council in New York. I am delighted to welcome you to IAAC Literary Festival of 2021. Indo-American Arts Council, or IAAC, is a New York-based nonprofit organization. We promote art, culture, dance, music, films from India, Indian diaspora around the world. And today I am so excited to introduce a conversation on autobiography of our very own Nobel Laureate, Professor Amartya Sen. And the leading conversation would be by an incredibly well-known person, John Makinson, whom I'll talk about in a second. Professor Amartya Sen is a Thomas W. Lamont Professor and Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University, and was until 2004 the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. Earlier on, he was a Professor of Economics at Jadavpur University in Calcutta, the Delhi School of Economics, and London School of Economics, and Drummond Professor of Political Economy at Oxford University. Professor Sen has served as President of Econometric Society, the American Economics Association, the Indian Economic Association, and the International Economic Association. Professor Sen's research and writing and the books are in the field of social choice theory, economic theory, ethics and political philosophy, welfare economics, theory of measurement, decision theory, public health, and others. Professor Amartya Sen has received the highest awards, which include Bharat Ratna from India, and of course, the Nobel Prize in Economics. He has received the highest and so many awards from countries like France, USA, Brazil, UK, Mexico. And conversation with him will be done by John Makinson, who is currently a chair of advisory board of Bodleian Library in Oxford and a member of board of Harvard University Press. From 2013 until the end of 2016, John was the chairman of Penguin Random House, the world's largest consumer book publisher. He was chairman and chief executive of Penguin Group between 2002 and 2013. John began his career as a journalist, first at Reuters, then Financial Times in 1994 as the newspaper's managing director, and 2 years later was appointed financial director at Pearson. John has chaired a number of not-for-profit organizations, including UK leading progressive think tank, humanitarian organization, Comic Relief USA, and the National Theatre. John is lucky. He divides his time between New York and London. So let us join them now. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Anil, for that introduction. And thank you very much indeed for all of you for hosting this conversation between Amartya Sen and myself today. You talk a little bit about my background. What I can tell you about my early background is that it was extremely quiet. And what I can tell you about Professor Sen's early background is that it was not. And what one reads from the early chapters of his magnificent memoir, which incidentally is now available for pre-order in the United States. So go to Amazon or your platform of choice and you'll be able to find it there. What one is struck by in the early chapters of the book is how kind of intense that early life was through the struggle for independence, through sectarian violence of the period, through the Bengal famine and so on. And so my first question for Amartya Sen is this: in shaping your present day outlook, and you are an individual with a strong outlook on the world, how would you balance up the influence of those very dramatic events and a family which was very distinguished and obviously extremely influential for you, and indeed, particularly at Shantiniketan, an educational experience which is also unusual and distinctive and exceptionally broad. So I'm just in thinking about how you came to be the person with the opinions and view of the world that you do. How would you balance up those influences?
Well, it's a difficult self-examination that you're inviting me to conduct. I'm very aware that I have been in an academic family, one way or the other, throughout my life. My father was a professor of chemistry. My grandfather was professor of Sanskrit. And I moved from one campus to another, including when my father, who was a professor at Dhaka University in what is now Bangladesh, moved as a visiting professor to Burma, to Mandalay. I think all these experiences were very strong in terms of their impact on me. And I think if there is a criticism I can make of myself, I could ask if so much of your background is from the academic world, how did you get, or did you in fact get, an opportunity to learn the rest of the world, the non-academic world? Are there gaps there? I don't think there are really big gaps there, or at least so I tend to think. But it's certainly true that quite often I've looked at problems immediately with an academic concern. For example, when I saw the Bengal famine of 1943, in which between 2 and 3 million people died, the immediate concern were, why is it happening? Is there any benefiting from it? How can we stop it? And so on. Similarly, when the riots erupted in my childhood, at the age of 11, I saw the first murder being committed outside our home, and a very bleeding day laborer who had come to that area to find a job at a low wage because there was nothing in the family to eat. And after he was knifed by the communal, hostile people from the other side, he was a Muslim laborer. He was killed by Hindu rioters. He came into our house, and I was extraordinarily surprised to find that somebody could have been killed by others who didn't even know who this guy was. But that was the nature of the riots. You kill people on the other community, and it didn't matter whether you knew them and not. In fact, most of the riot victims, both the Hindus and the Muslims, actually were very poor people. Their common ancestry and their common professional background was mostly labor at a low wage, because they're the easiest people to kill. They don't stay in secure homes. They have to go out to get a job, and in the process get killed. So I think in many ways I was pushed towards questions of some generality arising from the particular that I was seeing, like people starving in a famine or people being killed in a riot. Is that a limited perspective? To some extent, it might be, I don't know. But certainly that was my perspective, and I didn't feel that I was being very limited in my understanding, because there was this attempt to generalize beginning from my childhood.
Yeah. I mean, the book takes us forward sort of 30 years through your life, right? So the narrative ends in 1963. And you have had, therefore, 50 years to reflect on that early life. And my next question to you would be this. Had you decided, and you had other things to do at the time, but had you decided to write this memoir covering the same events at the same time, in the same place, in 1965, 2 years after the narrative closed, how would that book, in terms of its tone and emphasis and outlook, have been different from the book that you sat down to write 50 years later?
Well, it must have been, would have been definitely different in some ways, I think. But that's an abstract thought, really. I have no evidence that it would be. But I thought about my own life from time to time. One of the great merits of, or at least I thought a merit of going to school at Rabindranath Tagore's Shantiniketan, is that you are being constantly reminded to do some self-examination, which I did. And as time went, I often looked back and viewed part of my life differently than the way I had done earlier. So it's quite possible that if I did it, as it were, then and there, 63 is, as you mentioned, the book end, if it was 65, many of these things would be kind of present rather than history, present rather than past at that time. And I don't know, I think it's many of these questions about how identity of different individuals can clash with each other, even though there's nothing particularly hostile in them. I think I knew the hostility, but I think I understood better the nature of the hostility much later. Yeah, and the book is written after 9/11, let's say. Did 9/11 have an influence on the book? Yeah, I think it did. It must have. The fact that so many people got killed in two buildings which were destroyed immediately raised the question: how come this happened? Why were they doing this? What is the historical background to it? And how did the relations of people who got killed in, say, 9/11 felt about that? So I think I was inescapably influenced by events happening later, even though I don't think the main picture changed, but I think my take on it must have been influenced by the way the world looked as time progressed. The book I started writing, I think only about 15 years ago, and I'm 88 now, so it has been after the age of 70 I started writing, and that's different from what it would have looked like when at the age of 33 or something, I looked at, say, the Delhi University and other campuses where I was staying.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the question, I suppose, from both ends of a telescope. I mean, you're saying there, you know, how do I now view events that took place then compared with how I viewed them at that time? But one of the things that you do often in the book, I think, is sort of reposition figures and events through the lens of history to say the way the world viewed Karl Marx in the 1960s is different, of course, from the way in which the world views Karl Marx today. So I mean, I do think that is one of the strengths of the book is that the period that you have had to reflect on the things that were influential to you many years ago.
I think you're absolutely right there. And I think there isn't a way of making old experiences come back to you again as fresh input in your mind today. There isn't that trade. So I have to accept with what I have. There's the advantage that sometimes the past thoughts are still in your mind, even though they have been somewhat scrutinized, re-examined in the light of events that happened afterward, certainly. And I also felt quite strongly, I mean, consider the issue of identity. At the time when the Hindu-Muslim riots started, when I was, as I mentioned, around the age of 11, there was an attempt to focus on certain things and ignore others. Now, for example, it's very difficult to write Indian history, even the Hindu Indian history, without going to Muslim documents, like Al-Biruni, who was Iranian, but wrote in Arabic, who was a mathematician, wrote extensively about Indian mathematics around about 1000 AD, wrote extensively about Indian astronomy, wrote extensively about beliefs and why he thinks that different communities, this is Al-Biruni in about 1010 AD, why he thinks that the Muslims should study and not only seen as Muslim, but Iranian and Arab must study what's going on in India, just as Indians must study what's going in the Arab world. And this is the world in which Arab mathematicians who were, became very important in the history of the world, like Al-Khwarizmi, from whose name the word algorithm is derived, and from his book, Al-Jabr Muqabila, the word algebra is denied. Yeah, he was an Arab mathematician, but on the other hand, he also knew Sanskrit because he was interested in what the Indian mathematicians were doing. Now, that level of give and take becomes clear as we study history, look back at it. And Al-Biruni himself, being a scholar, started that. But most of the discussion at the time of the riot wasn't about that. It was about the Hindu customs, the Muslim Sharias and also customs, and so on. And I think in some ways it left a mark as to how you think about being a Hindu or being a Muslim. The first thought you might say being a Muslim is to think about algorithm and mathematics of an algorithmic kind. On the other hand, that's a very different beginning from thinking of Muslim as being someone who wants to follow the Sharia, as, for example, the Taliban or the Islamic ISI they would tend to do. And I think these are different perspectives, and the passage of time makes a difference to that. And I found reflection on it very interesting. And it's certainly true that as I've been trying to write it in the 1960s rather than now, I would not have the benefit of hindsight and historical studies, which we happen to have today.
So leading on from that, clearly a lifetime of study of the porous nature of international intellectual activity and how it can stretch across cultural boundaries, physical boundaries, religious boundaries, so on. That's for and has done for more than 2,000 years. That has informed a lot of your work and has informed your thinking. I would imagine about the contemporary political situation in India and the dangers of political sectarianism. So how do you connect those two issues? Because you are kind of reasonably active in the contemporary Indian political discussion, but you are also, as you were saying earlier, an intellectual by background and an academic who nonetheless engages with the issues of the day. And there are some balances to be struck there. So just talk about that issue a little bit.
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question, John, and not an easy one to answer. I think one of the things to look at here is that when something happens, and something happening means it becomes a part of history, that could be read in many different ways. And one of the things that's happened, particularly in the Hindu-Muslim relation, because it's such an important one for India. India is one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, in the sense of having more Muslims than almost any other country, with the exception of Indonesia and Bangladesh and Pakistan, and they're neck to neck with them in terms of numbers. It is possible to form certain view which reflects an attitude. Now, since there was, in the early days of Muslim conquest, there was a certain amount of violence going on, and certainly many of the attacks that took place through the northern corridor, not so much from the Muslims arriving in India through the sea and in the and of whom there were many coming to the west coast of India. The violence got reflected, and some people found it difficult to escape from that story to the other stories that also exist. And something got lost. For example, if I were to ask any Indian on the street, saying, can you mention to me the name of a building that is well known for its beauty, which was constructed in memory of the mother of the first translator of Hindu scriptures into foreign languages? You wouldn't think that the answer is Taj Mahal, but that is the case since it was the Muhammad Taj Mahal, whose memory Shah Jahan built the Taj Mahal. It was his son, Tarasiko, who was the first translator from Sanskrit into Arabic and through that it got translated into English, French, Latin, and so on. And so there is a clear connection between an Hindu background and a Muslim background, and that gets lost. Similarly, you wouldn't think about the poetry of you may or may not, but of the poetry of Kabir, poetry of Dadu, poetry of Mirabai, poetry of the Baus of Bengal, who drew from both Islamic as well as Hindu sources. So you couldn't think of Indian writing, calligraphy, Indian architecture, Indian painting, without bringing in the context of the Islamic background in India, and that is true just as much. It is true to say that many of the Muslim invaders were pretty violent and actually destroyed some temples like Somnath. So I think it's quite important to understand the importance of the variety of things that constitute a relationship between one group of people and another. And I think this is where history is really important. And what we are seeing in India today is a murder of history. Instead of doing a historical study, looking at all the things from Taj Mahal to Akbar's tomb, which are important landmarks, or the Rajasthani paintings strongly influenced by Mughal painting and so on, you may be being very lopsided, and that's true of some of the great writers who had overlooked it, and of course is very much more true of sectarian Hindu extremists. And I think the need to broaden everything is a historical task which we cannot overlook. So from that point of view, a later period has some justification.
So the title "Home in the World" positions you with a sort of nod of deference to Tagore as a person of the world, a citizen of the world, a person at home in different parts of the world. But at the same time, you do clearly identify as an Indian. You have retained your Indian citizenship, that is your home, and you identify also very much as a Bengali from your early days in Dhaka, but also obviously through Shantiniketan and the lifelong association you've had with the culture and the language of Bengal. Are there any sort of tensions as you think about these issues we've just been talking about? Is it a synthetic experience? Can you kind of easily meld these different views of the world that you have, or do you feel slightly differently about some issues as a Bengali, slightly different about them as an Indian citizen, and slightly different about them as a sort of, if you like, citizen of the world?
I think the multiplicity of experiences leaves not only the possibility of asking the question of synthesis, but it also leaves the possibility of asking, how can I make all these different parts of me all real without each obliterating the other? So I think in many ways, if I'm reading poetry, obviously I enjoy Shakespeare and Byron and Tennyson and so on. But I think the easiest in some ways would be Bengali poetry for me. And going back to Churjafod in 10,000 years ago, there were interesting poetry that still communicates with me. Now, it's important, and in some ways the book is concerned with that I could be enjoying Shakespeare while I'm also enjoying Tagore. I could be enjoying Byron while I'm also getting something from the Buddhist Churjafod of the 11th century AD in Bengal. Is that possible? Now, the book begins with an argument on that, which I actually happen to have with the BBC interviewer who was interviewing me rather more aggressively, John, than you have been doing the interview for me here today. And he was interviewing me when I came back to England as master of Trinity College, Cambridge. And he asked me what my identity was, which one. And since I couldn't mention only one, because all these being raised in India, living in America, having been educated to a great extent in Cambridge in England, all these were part of my identity. He thought I had no identity, no sense of identity. Now, I tried to argue that the opposite conclusion could be drawn. These are all my identities. Now, I think to the extent the book is trying to say something, it's the simultaneity of various different features that we could live with and that human life consists of. And if that's a somewhat difficult problem, well, the book is a somewhat difficult book for that reason. And so I think I would opt for not a kind of synthesis in the sense that it obliterates certain influences and concentrates on others. It somehow finds room for many different things. You might be able to enjoy a fish curry made of Irish march, while you also like the Dover sole that may be served to you somewhere else. And I think it's that multiplicity which I value and I believe it exists, and I think we lose it only through a narrow-mindedness, which has many other features in religion, in nationality, in our racial identity, ethnicity, and so on. And I would be in favor of a broader approach, and that I try to work on a bit. And as I travel around Europe, mostly hitchhiking, mostly staying in youth hostels, and meet lots of people from Italy, France, Germany, Norway, Denmark, and so on. I get a sense of myself which is broader than me encountering these foreigners, quote unquote.
Well, as you know, I've also spent part of my life living, part of my life working in India and in America and in the United Kingdom. So I'm kind of instinctively sympathetic to that perspective. And it seems to me a perspective that is more valuable today probably than it has ever been, as we live in a world of much more sort of oppositional and bifurcated sort of communication and political discussion. So I think it is, absolutely a message for today. But I want to move on now to a hypothetical question. So as a hypothetical question, it's obviously an unfair question, but I'll ask it all the same, which is that the narrative, as we discussed, finishes in 1963. I'm not sure there are plans to write volume 2, but if the subject of this conversation was Amartya Sen 1963 to 1993, what would the principal themes, do you think, of that discussion be? And that's partly an attitudinal question. It's maybe a little bit of an intellectual question as well, of what your preoccupations were as you kind of shaped your career trajectory in the directions that you'd had chosen in your 20s, and with the intellectual influences you describe in the book, very fully. As you moved on into your kind of mid 30s and 40s and 50s, what would those themes have been?
Well, the experience of living and working in different countries must figure in that, because while I did teach in India, part of the time, most of the time, I taught in America, in Britain, and elsewhere. So I think there is that, and my concern included the well-being of my students, making sure that we are doing a good job running a good center of education, and also living in a world that is productive and peaceful and in harmony with each other. All these concerns have been mine one way or another as I moved from one place to another. Now, these concerns, these are rather concerns of responsibility, quote unquote, were not so big in my early days, which is covered in this book. Admittedly, I was active in students' political movement, and I led some of the charges, as it were. And I also had a role in students' activism in terms of political debate and discussion, and felt I wasn't doing my job if I didn't bring in issues that I felt I ought to bring in, because given my background, I was able to do it in a way that a person with a narrower or different background might not have been able to do. So I think all these concerns were there, but they wasn't like running Trinity College. It wasn't like, what would it be like to be in charge of teaching social choice theory in Harvard University or in Oxford University, for that matter. And these things happened later. The other thing that happened, of course, my life got more entangled, in the sense I was, I had relationships, I got married, I even got divorced one occasion, and there were other people involved in it. So one couldn't have written a biography of the kind that I do up to 63. This is shortly after I got married, but my whole life was marital life. My non-isolated life was still there. It's difficult to write because you're also writing about other people. There's an issue of fairness, there's an issue also of paying attention to the perspectives that other had of relationships that you might wish to see from a narrower and more personal perspective. So it would be a much harder exercise, both because the entanglement, which are really enormously important in our lives, but also because of one sense of responsibility that is inescapably a part of age and becoming taken to be, whether or not correctly, as someone able to look after institutions in a way that the institutions need to be looked after. So it's a more difficult question. So if you were to ask me the question, have you done the easier part of the biography, leaving the difficult one to be done in the future? The answer is yes.
Yes. Well, and then, of course, there's volume 3, right? I mean, volume 2 would only take us up to 1993, and then there's another 30 years to go. I mean, one of the things that struck me most about the book was your concern for friendship, your investment in friendship, the importance of friendship to you. And I could see that becomes a slightly more complicated thing as one moves forward in life. But I also wanted to ask about your sort of humanitarian agenda, your concerns around issues of poverty, inequality, wealth distribution, human development, and so on. Did that focus change a lot as you moved into what we might call non-existent volume 2 of the memoir?
Yeah, to some extent, I think it's a very interesting question you're asking, and I don't address it in the book or anywhere else that I know of. So it is really an interesting question. But you see, when I was a student, I was a pretty politically active person from a more left-wing perspective, and then I thought that we need a lot of change in the world before good can be done. Now, I think over time, I formed a view that you can do a lot of good even in the world as it exists. This is not a view that was dominant in my mind when I was, say, in Santiniketan, a student, or in Presidency College, Calcutta, a student, or if for that matter, a student in Trinity. But later, it came, partly because as a writer, I could see that there are, even if it may not be grand, but there's some influence to what you write. I happen to hold certain positions, like for about 3 years being the president of Oxfam, and then you have a lot of activities connected with it. Sometimes you find eventually they're too big for you to carry for very long. On the other hand, it's a world that wasn't open to me, mainly because of my mental limitation when I was young, because the idea you change the world and then it will be yours, and then you do things there, as opposed to even in this world you could bring about some substantial change within the structure as it exists now. That is a somewhat later thought in me, but it became much more dominant way of my thinking in the, as it were, second half of my life than in the first half.
So I think we are approaching the kind of end, sadly, of this discussion, because we could happily carry on all day. This isn't the first such discussion you've had, so you have been kind of zooming away a bit the last few weeks. And I just wanted to ask if all of a conversation with friends, with scholars, with family, about the memoir, which has been extremely well received everywhere it has been read so far. Would that discussion have caused you to change any of the content, the balance, the emphasis in the book?
I think if I divide changes which are foundational and changes which are presentational, I think I wouldn't think that the foundationally it changed much. But presentationally, there are many things that I, now looking back, think I could have done better. I could have done more easily for others to appreciate what's going on. And in that respect, my communicational interests have expanded a lot more than what it was 50 years ago, let's say. So is that an improvement? I don't know. It's a change.
It's a change. Well, Amartya Sen, I'm sorry I gave you an easier time than the journalist from the BBC all those years ago. I feel embarrassed about that. But thank you for spending the past hour in our company. And I am now going to pass the baton back to our host, Anil Bansal. Thank you, Amartya.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. I have one question to ask you before you go, sir. Poverty, you have done most amount of work in poverty. And poverty is not only an Indian problem, it is a problem in the world. What are the three things you think the younger generation must do to alleviate this extreme poverty which we seem to have in the world?
Well, I would say poverty requires a fuller understanding and mustn't be confined to three things. So the first of the three things I would say is that don't think of three things. Think of 135 things that you need to do in order to reduce poverty. That includes how people see each other. It depends on how you treat each other in Indian context, caste, divisions of religion, division of status will come into it. Then there is also being rich and poor. All these will come into it. All these are matters that we have to address in dealing with poverty. So I think my main thing would be, and it isn't three, it's mainly one, namely that the more we can think about ourselves being like each other, but caught in unequal circumstances, the easier it is for us to include others in your understanding, in your perspective. And I think that is important both because of how it influences your general thinking, but it's also important how it influences your politics. And if your politics goes in the sectarian direction, that does more harm to the challenge of tackling poverty than almost anything else. And so I'm delighted you asked the question. I just tried to broaden the question, but you gave me the chance to do just that. So thank you very much.
You're welcome, sir. And on behalf of the entire IAC family, we sincerely thank Dr. Amartya Sen and John Makinson. Viewers are now volunteers for producing, participating, and watching this program. As mentioned before, the book is available for pre-order now on Amazon and should be shipping starting January 25th, 2022. And folks, please stay in touch with us at IAC.us or on our Facebook page. We are regularly bringing you art and culture to you. Please note that the 22nd annual New York Film Festival will be held in April of 2022. The New York Indian Film Festival is North America's oldest and the most prestigious film festival, which features cinema from India and the Indian diaspora. Presented by Indo Arts Council, New York Film Festival, we call it KNIFE, celebrates alternative, independent cinema from the global Indian community. And we are so thrilled to join Indian Consulate of New York in celebrating the 75th year of independence of India in 2022. And please note that we are planning some mega events. So please watch out for announcement. And remember that we are a nonprofit organization and we depend on support from people like you. So thank you and namaskar.